Well, good afternoon. It is February 10th, 2023. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Idagio. Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. Many of you are coming to Idagio for the first time today, so I want you to know that Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My name is Fred Plotkin, and if you don't know me, I've worked in opera since 1972 when I was a teenager. I do broadcasting. I've written books about opera and classical music and also love Italian food and have published many books on Italian food. I do a Friday program in which I talk to musicians and people in the arts and culture and ideas. And I had a wonderful guest scheduled for today. And unfortunately, there was a death in his family and he asked to postpone, and we send our condolences. And therefore, I had to decide what would I want to do today. And I'll tell you in a moment, I realized that typically I say that it is 2 p.m. in New York. It is 1 p.m. in a place called Laurel, Mississippi. It's 11 a.m. in San Francisco, California. It's 7 p.m. in London. It is 8 p.m. in Milan and Vienna. And as always, special love to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong. And special love to all the people in Turkey and Syria who have been affected by those horrible earthquakes. We stand with you. We send support. I decided today that rather than trying to find another guest at the last minute, because my guests tend to be very busy people, I looked at the calendar and it said February 10th. And I realized that that date rang a bell for me. And the reason is it is the 96th birthday of the magnificent American soprano, Leontyne Price. I had the great fortune of working with her in the 1980s, of coming to know her, of spending a lot of personal time with her, talking with her, learning from her, attending classes she gave, sitting down just with her one-on-one and talking about her life a fair amount. And it's knowledge that I've kept mostly within me and treasure because I learned from what she taught me. I can't share all of that with you today. I hope to share some of it. But what I would like to do is point you to the fact that on Idagio, idagio.com, I've created a specific listening guide to some of the greatness that is Leontyne Price. And when I talk today about her, I'll talk about some of her music and some of her roles. And you can then go to https://app.idagio.com/profiles/Leontyne Price about, and or go directly to the page and they will feature my playlist, Fred Plotkin's playlist for Leontyne Price. So who is Leontyne Price? She was born Mary Violet Leontyne Price on February 10th of 1927 in Laurel, Mississippi. I have been to many American states. I have not been to Laurel, Mississippi. But if you look at the calendar and you study your history, you know that America in the 1920s, and unfortunately for many decades to follow, was rife with discrimination, prejudice against Black people and against certain other people, but frankly, sadly, tragically, primarily against persons of color who are identified as Black, African American, Negro, whatever the term of the time was used, but we know what we're talking about. And she was born to a father, James Anthony Price, who was a carpenter. Her mother, Catherine Baker Price, was a midwife. Her brother, George, who I also knew, was born 2 years later in 1929. And the family was deeply religious. They were Methodists, and they were also very musical. And the father played the tuba and the mother sang. And Miss Price always said to me, and I'm going to say sometimes Miss Price and occasionally Leontyne, sort of depending on the situation which I described her. But Miss Price always said to me that her mother had the gorgeous voice, as Luciano Pavarotti always said to me that his father had better tenor than Pavarotti was. She showed her musical talent very early, and her parents traded in their phonograph for a piano, an upright piano, and Leontyne began her lessons on piano at 3.5 years old. At age 9, she was taken to her first vocal recital. It was given by the great American contralto Marian Anderson, also African-American, Negro, Black, the term you prefer, and it was given in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, I've not been, but it is a city that has had terrible strife and discrimination. Right now, there's a crisis in which the pipes produce water that's undrinkable and is poisoning people. It's a place that is troubled. Let's leave it at that. And certainly the times back then in about 1936 were very troubled because it was also the economic depression. And yet, when young Leontyne was taken to hear Marian Anderson, she told me that the first thing that impressed her was the voice, the sound of this contralto voice, the richness, the beauty. It was also the dignity of Marian Anderson, which is something I believe, and I think Miss Price would agree, you cannot invent dignity. You cannot act dignified if you are not dignified already. And Marian Anderson certainly was, and Miss Price certainly is. And then she told me that it was the music. It was the sound of the voice, the presence of the artist, but the way the music reached her without amplification, obviously, but just the sound of this voice and whatever it was on the program, which probably combined classical works by Brahms, I would imagine, and spirituals, really, really touched Leontyne Price. And it was an example that we still know today that if you can see it, you can be it. And that pointed her more toward the idea of having a musical career. It helped to have herself a gorgeous voice, excuse me. But the South was no place for a young Black woman to be able to go to school and get the kind of education she needed. So she went north to Wilberforce, Ohio, to Central State University in Ohio. It was called an HBCU, now called that, Historically Black College and University. And there are many of these fine institutions throughout the United States. Some of them are now in the South, especially Atlanta, Louisiana, and a few other places. But at that time, they were in Washington and places north. And she got in. She did not study voice immediately. She did other studies and then went toward voice after singing in the chorus. And in 1948, at Wilberforce, she attended and participated in a master class by the great American bass, civil rights leader, activist, social force, magnificent man that was Paul Robeson. And he understood her special talent, her drive, her particular charisma that went beyond charisma. You can call it the kind of dignity, the kind of presence that you can either have or not have, and she certainly does. And he helped her pursue attendance at Juilliard, Juilliard being the school in New York City, one of the great music schools in America. And so Price came to New York City, and she lived in Harlem at the YWCA, which is a place where young Black women arriving in New York could stay and live safely and with dignity. And at that time, Juilliard was near Harlem, so it was not that far a trip. Now it's at Lincoln Center. And Price, like many students at Juilliard, whenever she could, would attend concerts and performances at the Metropolitan Opera. And she heard the soprano Luba Valic as Salome. And she said to me that this was the night where she said, I understand what opera is, what opera could be. Balich was a very sensual woman. She was beautiful. She had a powerful voice, incredible actress, incredible stage presence, and was very famous for her Salome. And for those of you who are not opera people, you should know that opera is not sung with microphones. Opera is a marriage of words and music to convey a story, to convey character, convey emotions. And when the composers wrote this music, they responded to the words, not just the meaning of the words, but the sound of the words to create extraordinary music. And Price began to pursue more opera at Juilliard, and she sang small roles in Puccini's opera Gianni Schicchi. She sang the First Lady in Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, and then someone understood her particular affinity for the music of Richard Strauss. We don't think of her now for that, and offered her the role of Ariadne in the opera Ariadne of Naxos in the second cast. The character is a prima donna in the best sense, and something happened, the alchemy that could only happen with a great singer, with an incredible talent and a gorgeous voice, that Price, according to people who saw it and heard it, became the prima donna. This does not mean an ill-tempered artist, although there is some of that caricature. She became the first lady, the great lady, the person you could not take your eyes off of and the person you could not take your ears off of. And she began to be noticed. She then sang her first Verdi role, Mistress Ford, Alice Ford, in his comic opera Falstaff. It's not a role that she came to be associated with, but it was her first contact with Verdi. And in 1952, while in New York, she was heard by the composer and critic Virgil Thompson, who cast her in his opera, in an all-black cast, Four Saints in Three Acts, with a libretto by Gertrude Stein. And this was presented not in New York at first, but in Paris. And that was Leontyne Price's debut in early 1952. She's a February baby, so she was just about 25. Then she came back to the States. Very importantly, she was studying roles. She had sung, let's call it traditional opera, and she was asked to sing the role of Bess in George and Ira Gershwin's and DuBose Hayward's Porgy and Bess, which was written in the 1930s. And it was controversial because it's a masterpiece, but it was a role that Gershwin's very progressive. This was not in any way dismissive interpretation of people who are people of color who are living in poor circumstances in South Carolina. But the lead characters are real characters with their issues, and they have one of them a physical disability, another one a terrible sense of insecurity, neediness. She's a drug addict, Bess is. And a lot of people said you don't want to do that because you'll become identified with these characters, with, quote, Black characters, and therefore not be able to sing in traditional opera. But it's a masterpiece of music, and it was the first major revival in a while. And she was cast as Bess. She sang it first in Texas, and it was a huge success. And then it went to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, and finally Washington. And this is very, very important to understand her connection, Leontyne Price's connection to Washington, D.C. She lives nearby there now. And she was seen by members of the American government, especially the State Department. And for those of you listening in every corner of the world, and I know you are, you may see America in a certain way. I'm not here right now to engage in political discussions too much, but America is not just a great political force, an economic force, and a nation with terrible contradictions and the virus of racism and prejudice that is very much a part of who we are, and we need to address that constantly still. But it's also a nation of phenomenal artistic achievement that is a combination first of the native peoples, but then all the people who either migrated here or were brought here enslaved and then were able finally to find some degree of freedom. And America to me is a great mixing pot. It's a mosaic that combines all these cultures and creates new things in traditional ways and in untraditional ways. The art forms of jazz, of rock and roll, all of that. I don't need to explain that to you. And certainly we have had classical music here in opera since the 18th century. Opera appeared in New Orleans, in Charleston, South Carolina, New York first, and then went elsewhere. And we've had orchestras. The New York Philharmonic was founded in 1842, the same year as the Vienna Philharmonic. So we have these traditions. Cities such as Philadelphia have very old theaters, and New York and Brooklyn, and therefore this is not new to us. And people elsewhere in the world say Americans have no culture. That's just not true. But what was distinct in this time, right after World War II, when Harry Truman was still president, he would go on to lose, unfortunately, in 1952 to Dwight David Eisenhower. But Harry Truman understood that American culture could be used for diplomacy, and American performers and artists could go to places and touch hearts, minds, and souls in a way that a diplomat never could. And the State Department had a program of sending American artists and performers around the world. And I should say that this is not just a Democratic Party thing. Dwight David Eisenhower, the Republican, very much believed in the arts. He was very instrumental in helping build the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts later on. He was the head of Columbia University at a certain point. He completely understood the role of the arts in society and diplomacy. This was continued by John F. Kennedy, sadly killed. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, was perhaps the greatest first lady when it came to being a proponent for the arts. And then Lyndon Johnson continued this, and then Richard Nixon, who funded the arts, whatever his flaws were, he funded the arts. And so did Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter. So it was really after Carter, with the arrival of Reagan, that art as a governmental extension became politicized in the United States. But by then, by the 1980s, Leontyne Price was such an institution and a revered figure that she was above that. But at the beginning of her career, Leontyne Price became one of the first exponents of greatness in American art abroad. And the State Department created a tour that sent this production of Porgy and Bess to several European countries. I just wrote them down, and let's see if I can find them. I created this talk for you this morning. So they went to Vienna, to Berlin, to London, and to Paris. And as it happens, in the Adagio catalog, we have a performance that I commend to you, Price and her Porgy, who was William Warfield, whom she married, and he was a magnificent bass baritone. I'll talk about him in a moment. And Cab Calloway, the wonderful entertainer who played Sporting Life. There's a very famous studio recording, but we at Adagio, you can hear that. But there's also now a recording that was captured live in Berlin in 1952, which means that you hear the audience, you hear how alive the artists are to the audience. It's not the most perfect audio, but that doesn't matter. This is a precious document from 70 plus years ago. And you can hear Leontyne Price in 1952, and that is a gift. Out of this came something that I think is very important to understand about Leontyne Price. Leontyne Price is a proud American. And I'm not saying this because I'm American. I'm not presenting my views here about our country. I love my country. But Leontyne Price is a very proud American and a patriot. And her brother, George, became a general. He rose to very high rank in the Army, had a very distinguished career in the Army. And I always knew him not as George, but as General Price. And an excellent man and a wonderful brother. And so her sense of her country is not only, and I hope you understand my meaning when I say only, as a Black person, as a Black American, although she's proud of that, but as an American, as a very emphatic American. And there are various moments throughout the career in which her sense of her being American and her sense of belonging to the society and being equal and deserving of benefits from what our laws, our Constitution provides, was very important. And her husband, and they married around the time of the Porgy and Bess tour, and they were together about 15 years, was the bass baritone William Warfield, who was originally from Arkansas. And so he too understood racial discrimination and prejudice. He, if memory serves, and I'm just relying on memory, then studied in the North, I think in Chicago, but don't quote me. But he too had an education outside of the South for his music. And he had a gorgeous voice. You can hear him on Adagio. He sang with conviction, something that I would say characterized his singing is that he sang truthfully. And if you are in music, you know what I mean. But what I mean is that he sang without affectation. He sang not to show off the beauty of the voice, not to underline emotions that he felt existed already in the music and the words. And therefore, listening to a William Warfield performance, you go much deeper into his soul and the soul of the characters that he played when he played opera. He did a lot of recitals. And so Price and Warfield lived in the America of the 1950s. For those of you not in the United States, and even many Americans don't know this stuff, we had a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court in 1954 called Brown versus Board of Education, whose motive was to desegregate education and to allow Black children to attend schools with white children. It didn't just happen easily because of the case being decided by the Supreme Court. There were terrible attacks against Black children in Arkansas, Louisiana, many places. And it was part of the ongoing struggle of the civil rights movement. Famously, Rosa Parks, it was part of the bus boycott in Alabama. Martin Luther King, born in 1929 in Atlanta, became one of the great orators. But the civil rights movement was a movement, and it was many people, most Black people, but many white people, especially Jewish people, stood in solidarity with Black people. And the civil rights movement, and this has been documented very well by Henry Louis Gates, and not only, was also about music and the glorious music that cut across all spectrums. And you had the great gospel artists and singers, Mahalia Jackson being one of them. And she would sing to Martin Luther King by telephone when he was despondent and raise his spirits. Clara Ward was a practitioner and a leader of gospel groups. Clara Ward came to know a very young girl named Aretha Franklin, born in 1942. And by 1954, Aretha was singing gospel and only later blossomed into the singer that we came to know. And there was still Marian Anderson, who by that point was well into her mid-50s, which is older for a career in classical music and opera, but especially opera. And Marian Anderson became the first Black artist to sing not a leading role, but an important role, Ulrika, in Verdi's Ballo in Maschera on January 7th, 1955. And that was done by Rudolph Bing because he wanted to be sure he was the head of the Met, to make the gesture to show that Black people can and should appear on the stage. Leontyne Price already was a prominent figure, though she was still quite young in her 20s, unlike Anderson, who was in her 50s. And Price sang, let's say, for the Met, but not at the Met. They did a concert elsewhere in a Broadway theater, and Price sang a song or two as part of that. In 1953, remember, Washington, the State Department, patriotism, she was invited to sing in a recital at the Library of Congress along with the man playing the piano, the composer Samuel Barber. And Samuel Barber at that performance premiered a song group called the Hermit Songs that he wrote specifically for Miss Price. They're glorious, and you can tell how he tailored the music to her voice. And that's part of my playlist on the Adagio catalog. And it was the beginning of a very special artistic and personal relationship between Samuel Barber and Leontyne Price that we will get back to. Another thing to understand about America in the 1950s is there were not millions of channels on television. There was the CBS broadcast network, there was the NBC broadcast network, eventually ABC, and eventually PBS public broadcasting. And only later did all of these other national networks come. There were local channels, but the two big ones were really CBS and NBC. And CBS had the New York Philharmonic, it had Leonard Bernstein, and NBC had the NBC Orchestra that had been created in the 1930s by Arturo Toscanini. And believe it or not, Toscanini was still alive in the 1950s as a very old man. And his orchestra played in Studio 8H of Rockefeller Center. Those of you who are Americans know a program called Saturday Night Live, and Saturday Night Live is done in Studio 8H. But at that time, it was the home of the NBC Symphony and the NBC Opera Theater. And television in the 1950s was often done live. And they decided in 1955 to do Puccini's Tosca featuring a very young Leontyne Price, still in her 20s, which is young to sing Tosca, frankly. And the tenor was a white man, David Polari. And what happened, without fanfare, frankly, from what I've gathered, is that we had the first interracial couple professing love for one another and kissing on the stage in this broadcast of Tosca. It was a success. And later, Leontyne Price was asked to sing Madame Lidouin, a role I'll talk about in a bit, from Poulenc's Dialogues of the Carmelites, Pamina, the leading female role in Mozart's Magic Flute, and very importantly, Donna Anna in Don Giovanni. And in my playlist for you, I have Price's first studio recording as Donna Elvira, actually, in this case. She sang both Anna and Elvira, which she made with Eric Leinsdorf conducting the Vienna Philharmonic and Birgit Nielsen as Donna Anna, Cesare Siepi, a wonderful cast, Fernando Corena. And you can hear again the very first early Leontyne Price on recordings. Now, those of you who are audiophiles know that there's a big difference between the studio, where things are recorded with good machinery, and live performances, such as the Porgy and Bess that you can hear from Berlin, in which someone is just capturing it either with a microphone on the stage, a single microphone, or perhaps in the audience. I'm not justifying this, but it has happened a lot. And the editing that can happen in a studio is very different from the editing that can happen in a live performance. That said, in the 1950s, the technology was not as sophisticated as now. So even studio recordings don't have the breadth that one would find now, but frankly, they have a lot more emotional heft. And it's a rather remarkable thing to hear Price as Donna Anna, as Donna Elvira in these magnificent Mozart roles that she came to do, not very often. But her Mozart, like her Richard Strauss, is something remarkable. And when I hear them, I always think, well, we associate her primarily with Giuseppe Verdi and Giacomo Puccini, but Strauss certainly, Richard Strauss certainly would have been a fascinating composer for Leontyne Price, whose soprano voice was perfectly suited, I believe, to a lot of the music, not all, but some of the music of Richard Strauss. For example, to hear her as the Marschallin and the Rosenkavalier would have been something extraordinary. But Ariadne is a perfect role for her. Also in 1955, we're going back a bit, she was brought in New York to meet a young Austrian conductor named Herbert von Karajan, who also was just in the early phases of his career. And she sang Pace, Pace mio Dio from Verdi's La Forza del Destino. And Karajan was so blown away by this, I read the accounts of the time, that he jumped up and he sat down at the piano and he worked with Leontyne further. Now, when you read these accounts, people think, well, that's so very unusual. Frankly, it's not that unusual. When a conductor is inspired and he or she played the piano, they do this to get more out of the singer. Antonio Pappano does it often today. James Levine used to do it. Riccardo Muti does it. There are many. Abbado did it. Carl Böhm did it. There are many conductors who have done that, but nonetheless, for young Leontyne Price to knock Herbert von Karajan off his tiny but very formidable feet was quite a coup. And he said, from now on, I want you to be my soprano for your European career. Price appreciated that, and she certainly worked with him. But she also understood her particular connection to her Americanness. And in 1956, when Russia, the Soviet Union, was invading Hungary and there was strife in Europe, Price went on another State Department tour with the pianist David Garvey and did recitals in India and Australia. So she went to places bringing her voice and bringing the voice of her country, as she saw it, to places that had not yet experienced her. It had not yet experienced too many American artists. I should say at the same time, Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong were touring more in communist countries, and Louis Armstrong in particular had a huge impact in the Soviet Union, and Ellington really wherever he went. But Price, as a, quote, classical artist, as an opera singer, went to different places with great effect. In the meantime, she was studying roles, as young singers do. She wanted to add to her repertory, and she sang for the first time in a concert version, Aida, Verdi's Aida, in concert with the Philadelphia Orchestra in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And as you can only imagine, it was a huge hit. And she began to get a lot of offers to sing Aida. And she, for the most part, turned them down on the advice of several people, including her husband, William Warfield, who said that when you arrive in certain theaters, but especially the Metropolitan Opera, then arguably the greatest, along with La Scala, that you should arrive as a lady and not as a slave. And therefore, she was discouraged from singing Aida as her calling card role, which is what singers call the first role they do in theaters. Luciano Pavarotti always sang Rodolfo from La Boheme as his calling card role. Joan Sutherland often sang Lucia di Lammermoor. And Price was advised not to sing a slave girl as her calling card role in these great theaters. I will leave that to you to decide whether you think it's a good idea. Instead, on September 20th of 1957, she sang her first staged operatic role in America at the San Francisco Opera. Now, I would say that the San Francisco Opera, along with the Met, were her two favorite American theaters. She sang elsewhere. She sang in Chicago, but she really had a special affection for San Francisco Opera, wonderful company, and the Met, wonderful company, the company I worked at and how I got to know her. And it was the role of Madame Ledoine in Poulenc's Dialogues of the Carmelites. And I'm saying it in English for the following reason. Many of you may have seen a recent production at the Met with a superb cast. It was sung in French. Poulenc was a Frenchman, and maybe in another program I'll talk about Poulenc. He was a fascinating figure, but he came from money. His family was part of the Rhone-Poulenc pharmaceutical empire, and therefore he didn't have to learn how to make money and survive. In his younger days, he was a gay man at a time when that was not necessarily advertised everywhere, but he lived openly somewhat. And for various reasons that you can explore, He had a religious conversion somewhere in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and became, I won't say a devout Catholic, but someone who was deeply moved by the Catholic faith. And I think there was an important difference there. And in the 1950s, he wrote this opera, the Dialogue des Carmélites, in French, his native language, but he dictated that the opera should be sung in the language of the country it's being given in. And it had its premiere not in France, but at La Scala in Milan, and it was sung in Italian. And later, it was sung at San Francisco Opera in English. It didn't come to the Met for many years after, with a fabulous production the Met has. But and Price was in the English language cast. When it came to France, it was sung in French. Now it's more the tradition to sing it in French, but you still often hear it in the native language. And this was a beautiful, moving opera. Price is not a Catholic, but I think that nor am I, but I think that the values of this opera transcend all religions and are about the human condition and what we live for and what we die for and what we strive for in life and who we are as people and the choices that we make. And it's one of the great masterpieces of 20th century opera. And you can hear that. And she then, because an artist had appendicitis, was asked to sing one performance of Aida in San Francisco, and she stepped in and sang that. But even with that, she was holding it for a while. She sang it in May 1958 in Vienna with Herbert von Karajan. She sang it in Verona once, but then she was spending more time in Europe and recording different opera performances. Now, I don't use the word competition because there's enough room and we love all the singers, but who are the great sopranos at that time who Leontyne Price may have heard of or have been considered not a rival for, but who the great artists were? At the Met, there was an artist from Yugoslavia named Zinka Milanov, and she's forgotten now, but for many people, she was the prototype of the Verdian soprano. And people from that era refer to Zinka Milanov for her performances as Aida, as Leonora in La Forza del Destino, Leonora in Il Trovatore. It's a kind of voice that we call lirico spinto. In other words, lyrical, but spingere in Italian means to push. And this is not a negative thing. It means it has a little more oomph than a lyric soprano. The lyric soprano is the girlfriend. The lirico spinto is the girlfriend who has more troubles and challenges and woes, and nonetheless often overcomes them or is willing to die for them. And Zinka sang those. She was no great actress, but an extraordinary singer. There was Licia Albanese from Italy, who sang more a little bit coloratura, which are the lighter, higher voices, but primarily lyrical roles. Violetta and La Traviata, the girlfriend roles, but also Madame Butterfly, which requires a lot more lirico spinto. There was Renata Tebaldi, gorgeous voice, very secure singing. There was Maria Callas, who was a New Yorker, but sang more in Europe, but extraordinary actress, extraordinary singer, but not one with the most beautiful voice or vocal security. There was Leonie Rieseneck, who Austrian soprano, magnificent artist in German, who was a great Ariadne, magnificent in everything she did, but again, not the most vocal security. There was Birgit Nilsson, who was the queen of the dramatic sopranos, the big girl roles, let's call them, of Turandot, of Brunhilde, of Electra, of Isolde, which most artists wouldn't touch, and if they did, they had trouble. Nilsson was the gold standard, and at a time when all the leading ladies at the Met were paid a certain fee, which I think was $2,750 a performance, Nilsson got $3,000 because she was just unto herself. Then there was also Joan Sutherland, and Joan Sutherland was the queen of the coloratura, remarkable singer, as secure as Nilsson, as Tebaldi, could do phenomenal things with her voice, and sang roles such as Norma and Lucia and Il Trovatore. And the point is that all of these artists may have sung certain roles in common, but you would go to maybe Zinka Milanov to Renata Tebaldi and then Leontyne Price for Aida. You might go to Sutherland maybe for Trovatore, to Albanese for Trovatore. Leontyne Price, in the middle of all this, found her niche in that, number one, her voice was gorgeous. I'll get to that in a moment. But number two, that there was a presence about her. And again, not because she was a Black artist, nothing to do with that. There was just something that she probably recognized in Marian Anderson, then recognized in herself, that you do not have to operatically act, if you know what I mean, for those of you who don't know opera. You can act with the voice. You can stand there, and if you sing as gorgeously, because it's not just the beautiful voice, it's the beautiful singing, with as much presence and emotional commitment that she probably learned with Madame Ledoine, if not before, and then grew with it in each of her roles. We came to her as audience members. She didn't have to push herself out to us. And Callas, Rieseneck were magnificent actresses, and they were thrilling and unforgettable. But at the same time, they were not minimalist, especially not Rieseneck. They could be. But Price literally could stand on the stage, sing magnificently well, connect to the character, hold her head up and her chin up in a way that I will never forget. And out came this beautiful sound. And people were astonished. And I will say one thing more about Leontyne Price, and as Leontyne at this point, is one of her biggest pieces of advice was, when it comes to singing, and she said this to every young artist she worked with, preserve the principle, only sing on the interest. And by that she meant that you should not damage, you should not tamper with the vocal gift that you have been given, and learn your fine technique, and then let the technique and the beauty of the voice and your connection to the music, your connection to the spirit of the character, to the spirit of the song, let that grow out. And this growth is the interest. I know it sounds like a banking term, and she meant it that way, but she also really understood that for the most part, if you husband your resources, you'll have a long career. And that's exactly what she did. She did not necessarily sing into deep old age, but that was her choice. However, as I will get to in a bit, she could sing deep into her old age and sound better than just about anyone else. As I said, the Met offered her Aida in 1958. Warfield said, you should arrive as a lady, not as a slave. So she went elsewhere, and she sang Aida at La Scala. She sang Cho-Cho San, Madame Butterfly, in Vienna, and later did Donna Anna with Herbert von Karajan in Vienna. In the meantime, she was doing recordings of these different roles at a time when the recording companies all wanted to document the singing and the performances and the voices of these great artists. At that time, LP, vinyl records were the way that people anywhere in the world, if they had a record player, where parents in the 1930s had a record player that they traded it for a piano. If you had a record player, you could hear Leontyne Price, Enrico Caruso, Maria Callas, whoever was performing, you could have them in your home, and that was an extraordinary thing. Radio also brought that to people. Many people never went to an opera, or if they did, it was a very rare and very special occasion. So Price was part of that era. Primarily RCA was recording her, other labels too. And all of this is on my playlist that you can find on the Adagio page, and then you can hear it on your own. But she began to record Leonora in Il Trovatore, Amelia in Un ballo in Maschera, all by Verdi. She began to do more Verdi. And one time I was sitting with her, and I said, I know that everyone calls you Verdi's soprano. She said, that's right. And I know that you are a beautiful Verdi soprano. And she said, well, I thank you. I'm honored. Leontyne's favorite word is honored. And I'm honored that you would say that to me. And I said, however, Miss Price, I think your favorite role is Madame Butterfly. And she paused and her eyes welled up. And she said, I've never said this to anyone, but since you asked me, I'm going to tell you. It is my favorite role. It's the one I feel most deeply. And the reasons why she felt it deeply, I'm going to keep to myself. Maybe one day I'll write about this, but I want you, the listener, when you go to hear on Adagio, her performance as Madame Butterfly, to understand that when she made this with Richard Tucker in Rome on the recording, this was the role that most deeply affected her. And she told me that at that time it was Jewish holidays and Tucker was religious. And they invited her to the Seder, to the Passover meal. And Price became part of the Richard Tucker and Sarah Tucker family and their boys, one of whom, Barry Tucker, runs the Richard Tucker Foundation today. And she said to me, this is the recording, this Madame Butterfly, that I most deeply connect with and remember because of what was happening in my life at the time. And then the Met said, okay, we'd love for you to come. You will sing Il Trovatore, the Lady Leonora, in the premiere on January 27th. I apologize, 1961. But then, please, you'll sing Aida and Donna Anna and Liu and Turandot with Birgit Nilsson, and then, please, Madame Butterfly. And in this first season, and by the way, the premiere with Franco Corelli of Il Trovatore made the front page of the New York Times. It was Corelli's debut as well. It was at least 35 minutes of standing ovation. Some people say more. And by the end of the first season in 1962, Price wound up on the cover of Time magazine, which was quite an honor for a woman, as she would say. It's an honor, who was still in her early 30s. And Rudolph Bing, head of the Met, was very ahead of his time, and I praise him for this, in terms of his sensitivity to racism and discrimination. He was of Jewish origin, had to flee Europe himself as an Austrian Jew in World War II. And he said the Metropolitan Opera, which has toured around the country for decades, will no longer play in any city in the South, such as Atlanta or Memphis or Dallas, if audiences are segregated. And we will bring our fine company and our artists to these cities, but starting this year, 1962, you have to integrate audiences. And it happened. And Price, a Black artist in the South, sang Minnie in La Fanciulla del West in Dallas, Puccini's La Fanciulla del West, and sang Donna Anna from Don Giovanni in Atlanta. And again, the way she was the lover of a white man in Toscan television, it's not that she set about to be the symbol, to be the one who made a stride forward for human rights and for civil rights, but yet she was. And she was very mindful of that. And I knew, because we discussed it a lot, that she knew that she was a symbol for many people, and not just Black Americans, but all Americans who wanted racial and social progress. And often I would be with her, and a young man or a young woman would come to her and talk about their feelings about her. And she would always turn the conversation and say, well, it's an honor to meet you. And you tell me about you, young man, and what's your name and where are you from? And I remember there was a young man from Jacksonville, Florida. And he said, well, I would like to become a doctor. And she said, well, I expect to hear from you. And I expect that you will be a doctor, and perhaps you'll treat me. And 10 years later, I was with her, and now a young man came in and he said, Miss Price, my name is, and he said his name. And she said, well, I remember you. You're from Florida, to use the accent, and you are going to be a doctor. Are you a doctor? Yes, ma'am, I am a doctor. Well, I'm very proud of you. What this was in effect a symbol not being mummified and not being frozen into place and living with her symbolism, but understanding the power of her symbolism and using it to instill that in others. In other words, what I mentioned earlier, if you can see it, you can be it. And so Price continued to take on these roles at the Met in the 1960s. It was a golden age for the Met and for her. And at the same time participated in national life, in the civil rights movement and so on, but not in the way that I described others. Her brother, was in the military, and they had the very strong beliefs about being symbols of all Americans and not only African Americans. And if people saw her and her brother as symbols of all Americans, they would have to take pride in themselves and in the Price family as Americans. And she sang Elvira in Ernani at the Met and Pamina, and a role that I loved her in, Fior di Ligi, Mozart's Così fan tutte, with a beautiful cast that included Tatiana Troianos, the American mezzo-soprano, Judith Raskin, George Shirley, black tenor, one of the first great black tenors who got to sing in public life at the Met and elsewhere, and now a professor at the University of Michigan, Cheryl Milnes, Ezio Flagello. And to hear Price spin out this gorgeous sound with Tatiana Troianos, who could match her, is one of the great things. And we have that recording on Adagio that I really just want you to listen to. Never mind the story, which some people object to. The Mozart was sublimely inspired when he did this. And then the Met, I should say, she sang Amelia and Ballo Mascala, Tatiana, Eugene Onegin, Leonora, and La Forza del Destino at the Met. And then the Met was leaving its old building on 7th Avenue and 39th Street. This long story that is told often. One of the tellings is in the film The Opera House by Susan Frumke that came out in 2017, about moving from the old Met to building the new Metropolitan Opera House that many of you know today. I'm going backwards a bit. May 14th, 1957 or 59, we'll have to check, but I know it's May 14th. Leontyne Price put on a helmet with President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and they dug the first ground for the building of Lincoln Center in the Metropolitan Opera. So already in the late 50s, Price was enough of a symbol that the President of the United States would want to be with her and she with him to begin the construction of Lincoln Center. That's how central she was to this place. So when the new Met opened in 1966, they commissioned an opera, Antony and Cleopatra, by Samuel Barber, Price's colleague. Justino Diaz played Antony. It's a much better work than it's remembered as, because you cannot open a new theater with a new opera when you don't know the technology, when Franco Zeffirelli, a brilliant artist, but one who was very improvisational, would suddenly decide we want to get rid of this pyramid, and Price was trapped in a pyramid at a rehearsal. It was scary. And therefore, and when the whole world came and Mrs. Lyndon Johnson, the First Lady, came, Price's parents came from Mississippi, all the eyes of the world were on the opening of the new Metropolitan Opera House. And although Price personally came out of this with distinction, it was a troubled opening. The Met did 9 new productions in its first season, in addition to repertory. And it was very, very ambitious. And I commend this documentary to you, not only because it's very well done by Susan Frumke, but because she, the director, managed to get a 90-year-old Leontyne Price to remember in exquisite detail the circumstances surrounding the opening of the new house. And I recommend that to you. I will only say one thing parenthetically about that. Leontyne Price, in my experience, has one of the best memories of anyone I've ever known. And that's why she was able to see a young man whom she had met 10 years before and remember that he was from Florida and that he was going to be a physician. I've never encountered a memory like this among singers and among people in general. And that's part of the magic of Leontyne Price. So therefore, to watch her in this film from 2017 at the age of 90, beautifully narrate the circumstances of 1966 is quite something. But in this period, Price had become so much of an institution that she would sing for popes, she would sing at presidential inaugurations, she would sing at state funerals, she would sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic at Congress. She was honored as one of the first Kennedy Center honorees. And she did less opera. She did do a fair amount of recording. She did many recitals and concerts. And I remember that I, as a boy, I heard her in operas at the Met, at the new Met. But I also heard her in recitals. And I'm not a singer, but I was so struck by what she described to me about Marian Anderson, the voice, the dignity, the connection to the music, the commitment. It was never for show. And I think that many audience members expected the diva, the prima donna, and so on. And yes, Price was always beautifully attired, had this aura about her, but it was never manufactured. It had the sincerity, the truthfulness that I mentioned about William Warfield. It was just an extraordinary experience to be in her presence when she was on the stage and you were in the audience. She took on her last new role, which was not technically a new role. It was Ariadne, Strauss's Ariadne in San Francisco, a role that she had done at Juilliard, but had put aside until then, because this was, in a way, the ultimate prima donna role. It was called, the character is called the prima donna. And she was to sing it at the Met. She had, I forget whether it was a vocal virus or something, and only sang 2 of the performances. And it was not felicitous because she was not in her best physical shape for that. And people said, oh, that's it for Leontyne Price. It was not. And in 1982, by then I was working at the Met, she and the great Marilyn Horne, who I see as her equal as an American institution, as a patriot, as a magnificent singer and artist and presence, and someone who's given so much to her country and not just to the art form. She and Marilyn Horne united in concert, and James Levine conducted the Met Orchestra. We have that on Adagio, and I want you to listen to the whole thing, but especially 2 things. Pace, pace mio Dio from La Forza del Destino, because this was the perfect example of Price living or functioning on the principle, on the interest, and not going into the principle. And there was a certain moment when Levine sort of slowed the orchestra and softened it, and it sounded like Leontyne would run out of breath, and then suddenly she recoups and hits a note. I'm getting goosebumps as I say this all these years later, 41 years later, hits a note so magnificently. And it was kind of like chucking a spear the way it came out into the audience, that the eruption of applause I had never heard for anyone in any performance up to that point. I have since with Nielsen, with Hildegard Behrens, with a few people, but there was just something so spontaneous. And you hear some of the applause on the album, but it went on and on and on and on and on. She then sang for an encore, Qu'il bel sogno di Doretta from La Rondine by Puccini. Now, after doing this big Verdi and absolutely bringing down the house and shaking the theater, she sang this very delicate, beautiful little arietta, little song. And you would say to me, well, why does Price do that? That after having sung this theater shaking aria, would she sing this? And this was because Price said to me, and not only me, that she loves the voice, not my voice, not her voice, the voice, because for her, the voice was given to her by God and that she was responsible for it. And she had to learn the technique and she had to know how to use it. And she exquisitely knows how to use it. And so what we get are 3 minutes, not even, of just vocal perfume, of beauty. And it was a different kind of applause after. It was not an explosion. It was an exhalation by the audience of 3,786 people, 212 standees officially, but there were many more. And horn was fabulous on this. They sang duets. Horn sang Handel and Rossini. They sang Madame Butterfly together. They sang Così fan tutte together. It was just two artists at their peak, with James Levine perfectly understanding how to conduct so that these two ladies could show off their voices and their gifts and their talents. And I remember people saying, okay, well, that's Price's farewell because you can't top that. And then she came back and did Leonora in Il Trovatore in 1982, the role that had been her debut. And she said to me and to a few people that I'm not announcing this, but I'm going to retire, as she said. And this is it. And she wasn't old, certainly not old at all. 1982, she was born in 1927. You figure it out, I think 55 or so, which is an age when certain singers retire. But she had so much in her that she didn't have to retire. But she said, I need to go out when people don't say she should have left already. And she didn't announce the farewell, and she sang the Trovatore. And then James Levine persuaded her to come back and do La Forza del Destino and put together a good cast and promised an international television transmission. You know that the Met now does opera in HD, seen in theaters around the world. At that time, we would park a truck outside the loading dock, and this truck on public broadcasting in America and other broadcasting networks around the world would transmit live from the stage what was being done on the stage. And it was not a pretty production, that Forza, but it had a very good cast. And everyone thought, well, that's it. That was 1984. And then Levine said to Leontyne, Lee, we have to end with Aida. And Miss Price agreed to sing Aida in basically December of 1984. And the last performance was January 3rd, 1985. And that was not streamed, it was broadcast live on public broadcasting. Anyone who heard her sing O Patria Mia in the third act of Aida, in which that's a woman, no longer a slave in our sense of this character, but a dignified woman who happened to have been enslaved, and there's a very important difference, singing O Patria Mia about my homeland. And Verdi understood about nationalism, about homeland, about citizenship, and so on. And in addition to just the gorgeousness of the singing, Price was deeply moved, even then, well into the career, not just about concluding her career at the Met, but what this song, this aria, meant in terms of patriotism and a sense of self, a sense of nationalism. And at that time, thankfully, camera work did not dictate that. They felt that the viewers had to be amused all the time, and they changed angles all the time. When Price sang O Patria Mia, and you can see it on YouTube, the camera stayed on her. And after it ended, and the audience erupted in ovations, her eyes began to glisten with tears, and Levine stayed in the orchestra pit. The members of the orchestra were deeply moved and were crying. I was in the wings, so I saw her from this side, and I saw the tears glistening in her eyes, and she held her head up the way Marian Anderson would, the way she always said to me, hold your head up. And then at a certain point, she put her head down because it was emotionally that much for her. And then she picked her head up And she continued. And she sang the rest of the opera. I will, at another point, probably tell this story about the experience of being with her in the wings after. It was profoundly moving. She was ready to be done with opera, not because she didn't like it, not because she didn't have it left, but she'd done everything she felt she could do in opera, and that there was more to do in life. And she continued to sing in recitals and concerts and take on new music. And I went to hear her in Newark, New Jersey, at the Performing Arts Center, and she sang an impossibly difficult aria beautifully from Mozart's Idomeneo, and the character of Elettra. And I asked her why, and she said, because I haven't done it yet. I have more to do. And that was the Leontyne Price in the post-Med era, doing things that she could not yet do. So on Adagio on my playlist, and I want you to just go deep into Adagio itself, you will find 5 albums called Prima Donna Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, Volume 5. And these treasurable albums include all kinds of music and all kinds of roles that perhaps she didn't sing because she wasn't offered it, because life didn't bring her that. We do have documentation of her Poulenc songs, but we also have her singing Dido and by Henry Purcell. We have her doing more Samuel Barber. We have her doing Giancarlo Menotti, Benjamin Britten. We have her singing Wagner, and she could have done that too. Believe me, she could have done that. And she would have been, for example, a magnificent Elsa in Lohengrin. The mind boggles at what she could have done, but she always did either what she was offered or what she felt was best for her. If you're just starting with Leontyne, it's what everybody refers to as the Blue Album. For the Beatles, it was the White Album, but for Leontyne, it's the Blue Album. Back from 1961. And there were 3 arias from Leonora e il Trovatore, 2 Madame Butterfly, 2 Liu and Turandot, and 1 each from Tosca and La Rondine that I mentioned before. And listen to her early La Rondine, and then listen to the live concert at the Met in 1982. It's called The Art of Listening, comparative listening. And you will discover that it's not that Price repeated what she did before. She found new things in every piece of music that she sang, new ways of expressing the words. And unlike many singers where, frankly, there was vocal decline, for the most part, everything was pristine and in perfect shape, vocally, musically, technically, well into the career. And then gradually she stepped away. She did master classes at Juilliard I went to, and it was a beautiful experience, but a challenge because these young artists were singing for the great Leontyne Price. And Price would come up and encourage them to do something and then sing an example. And the audience would erupt in applause. And she said, no, this is education here. And I'm giving an example, but there we were in the 1990s, suddenly hearing Leontyne Price, beautifully vocally preserved, singing gloriously. And it was just an experience of contact with that sound that if you were in its presence, you were boggled by it. And she knew it, but she never, quote, worked it. She just knew that this was her gift and her responsibility. And then she retired, and I saw her on a couple of occasions in the 90s, and we got together at one point and had a very long discussion on many topics, and it was important that we did that, and I learned from her. She also came to one of my cooking classes that I gave, and so beautifully attired, and the people at the class had no idea who this gorgeous woman was. And when people were a little hesitant to buy my cookbook, because why? She said, well, I'm going to make this my holiday gift, and I'm going to buy 50. How many are there? And I said, well, there are 100. She said, I'll take 100 then. And everyone at the class said, no, I want one. So I sold the number of copies to the people there, and what was left Leontyne Price did buy and made it her holiday gift for her friends, or I assume that's what she did. Magnificent woman. And I remember that at that class where my head was down, I was cooking carbonara. I saw her in the back raising her hand as, lift your head, be proud, stand up, deliver, it's an honor that you are giving to these people, and deliver it. This was not snobism. This was a sense of self, a sense of pride in what we can do. And it's one of the many, many lessons that she imparted, not just to me, but to millions of people. And then she quietly retired. And I thought that, she would have a happy retirement. And then on September 11th, 2001, you all know that New York City was attacked. The World Trade Center was destroyed. The city was deeply wounded. We lost 3,000 people. There were fires burning for months. It was a horrible situation. And certain performing artists decided to get together, led by James Levine and Leonard Bernstein and not Leonard Bernstein, James Levine, and a number of other people, Yo-Yo Ma, and perform a concert at Carnegie Hall. And I should say, let me back up a bit. At Carnegie Hall in 1987, I was on the steering committee for something called Music for Life. And this was the first concert to raise money in the classical field to support research, but to support people with AIDS. And Leontyne Price and Marilyn Horne and James Levine and Leonard Bernstein and a few other people came and performed at a time when certain people would not step forward and associate themselves with a disease such as AIDS. And she said it has to be done. It's a patriotic thing to do. And so on September 30th of 2001, there was a surprise appearance at this performance by Leontyne Price. Let's calculate her age, 27, 73, 74 years old. She came out on the stage and she sang two songs. She sang This Little Light of Mine, which was her favorite song from the spiritual repertory. We have a recording on Adagio of Leontyne Price singing spirituals. We have another recording, I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free. I want you to listen to that one as well, because that song is often sung upbeat with a lot of tempo. She sings this like an art song by Schubert or Brahms, just connecting to the beautiful melody and the words. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. And this to me is the greatest performance of that song ever that I've ever heard. But at this concert with her surprise appearance, she sang This Little Light of Mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. And that is very much who she was and is. And then she didn't sing the national anthem of the United States. She sang God Bless America by Irving Berlin, a cappella. And for those of us who know music, perfectly, beautifully, gorgeously. But I can tell you, I was in the balcony that night with my cousin Alice, that I was not for a moment analyzing the musical performance. It was astonishing to see the 74-year-old Leontyne Price coming out, supporting New York, where she still lived at the time, supporting America, supporting people who believe in decency and human kindness. And after that, she has largely withdrawn from public life. She lives happily, from what I gather. I know where she lives in retirement. She's doing very well. You can see the Susan Fremke film from 1990, I'm sorry, when Leontyne was 90 in 2017. And I commend to you all of this music that is only a part of the Leontyne Price collection at Adagio. I'm not saying this to promote Adagio, although it's a very worthy endeavor that I want you to get to know and join, if you would, as a subscriber, because just to hear that Porgy and Bess from 1952, this treasure that is hard to come by, is worth it. But then you're going to spend many, many hours immersed in the art in the beauty, in the human spirit that is Leontyne Price. And I'm happy that I was able to pull this talk together pretty quickly, but especially because if somebody out there today has never experienced Leontyne Price, you are in for an honor, as Leontyne Price would say. And it was an honor to be with you. And above all, thank you. God bless you, Leontyne Price, and for everything that you are, that you have done, and that you've given the world.